The secrets of taste revealed.
Did you know that in the Middle Ages a small bag of pepper could be worth more than a cow? Imagine walking into a bustling medieval market, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread, and seeing merchants guarded like royalty, not because they carried gold or jewels, but because they carried sacks of spices. These were treasures from lands so far away that most people could barely imagine them, brought over mountains, across deserts, and through pirate-infested seas. A single handful of peppercorns could seal a business deal, settle a debt, or serve as a lavish gift to impress a noble lord. In a world without refrigeration, without modern preservatives, spices were more than just flavour, they were power. Salt too was far from ordinary. Known as white gold, it was one of the most sought-after commodities in all of Europe. Salt didn't just season food, it preserved it, keeping meat, fish, and even some vegetables edible for months, sometimes years. Entire cities grew rich on the salt trade, and wars were fought over access to salt mines. Controlling salt could mean controlling armies, because soldiers needed preserved rations to march and fight. For the medieval mind, salt was not just a kitchen staple, it was life itself. But spices and preservation methods didn't just shape medieval diets. They shaped politics, economics, and even the course of empires. Venetian merchants became some of the wealthiest men in Europe by controlling spice routes from the east. Arab traders held the keys to desert caravans and sea passages that connected India, China, and the Spice Islands to Europe's hungry markets. Rulers imposed taxes and tariffs on every step of this journey, turning cinnamon sticks and nutmeg seeds into symbols of royal wealth. These were not luxuries you sprinkled carelessly over your meal. They were a display of status for the privileged few who could afford them. In this journey, we're going to step into that medieval world not as passive observers, but as curious travellers. We'll follow the winding routes of the spice trade from the bustling ports of the Indian Ocean to the lavish feasts inside stone castles. We'll peek into smoky kitchens where cooks guarded their recipes like state secrets. And we'll watch peasants in small villages preserving their meagre harvests for the long, brutal winter ahead. Along the way, we'll discover methods of keeping food fresh without a refrigerator, salting, smoking, pickling, fermenting, that not only fed a population, but also influenced what dishes survive to the present day. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a simple spice rack could be a treasure chest in medieval Europe, why salt could make or break a kingdom, and why some flavours from that time disappeared for centuries. You'll also see how our own modern kitchens still carry echoes of that distant age. So ready to explore the tastes, the secrets, and the preservation techniques that fed 1,000 years of history? Let's begin.
The roads that fed empires.
Long before the medieval knight set foot in his stone castle for supper, the story of his food began thousands of miles away in lands he might never see. In the lush, humid coasts of India, pepper vines twisted their way up tall trees, each cluster of berries holding the promise of fortune. In the spice gardens of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, cinnamon bark was peeled from trees and dried under the fierce tropical sun. Farther east, in the lush valleys of southern China, traders gathered star anise and cassia, while merchants in the spice islands of modern Indonesia collected cloves and nutmeg. These were the birthplaces of flavours that would transform European kitchens, though few in Europe had any idea where they came from. The journey of a single spice was nothing short of epic. Pepper harvested in Kerala might first be packed into woven baskets and loaded onto riverboats bound for the Arabian Sea. Cinnamon would be bundled tightly in long rolls and stored in the holds of merchant ships. Cargo would pass through the hands of countless middlemen, Indian sailors to Arab traders to Venetian merchants, each adding their own profit to the price. With every transfer, the spices became not just rarer, but more expensive until they reached markets in Europe, where only the wealthy could dream of affording them. These routes were not simply trade corridors, they were lifelines of culture, commerce, and power. Arab traders played a central role in guarding these routes. Based in bustling ports like Aden, Muscat, and Alexandria, they controlled the sea lanes that connected the east to the Mediterranean. Their ships, laden with spices, silk, and precious stones, navigated through monsoon winds and treacherous waters. Caravans then carried goods overland across the scorching Arabian deserts, moving slowly from oasis to oasis. The Arabs didn't just trade goods, they traded stories, ideas, and technologies, acting as the cultural bridge between Asia and Europe. This control gave them immense leverage over the flow of spices, allowing them to dictate both price and availability. Eventually, the spices reached the great city-states of Italy, with Venice reigning supreme. Venetian merchants had carved out a monopoly on the spice trade into Europe, building their wealth on exclusive agreements with Eastern suppliers. The narrow winding canals of Venice bustled with activity as galleys unloaded fragrant cargo sacks of pepper, bundles of cinnamon, baskets of ginger. These goods were then distributed across Europe by river cart and coastal ship. Venice's position made it the gateway to the east, and for centuries it prospered by keeping that gate firmly under its control. But the journey was more than a chain of transactions. It was a saga of risk and reward. Spices travelled through regions ravaged by war, threatened by piracy, and plagued by unpredictable weather. Ships could sink in storms, caravans could be raided in the desert, and entire fortunes could be lost overnight. The profit margins were so great, however, that merchants willingly took the gamble. A successful voyage could make a trader rich beyond imagination, and the promise of such wealth kept the spice routes alive despite their dangers. For most Europeans, the origins of these spices remained shrouded in mystery. Medieval maps were filled with imaginative drawings, giant serpents guarding cinnamon trees or pepper, harvested under the watchful eyes of mythical birds. These were not just fanciful stories. They were part of the allure that made spices even more desirable. The less people knew, the more exotic and valuable these goods became. Knowledge was power, and the merchants who held that knowledge guarded it fiercely. Thus, from the green hills of southern India to the glittering palaces of Venice, the spice routes formed a network that was as much about human ambition as it was about geography. Every mile of the journey added layers of history, culture, and myth to the humble peppercorn or cinnamon stick. By the time these spices reached a European kitchen, they carried with them the scent of distant lands and the weight of countless human hands. This was the silent journey behind every medieval feast, a journey that linked east and west in a chain of flavour, fortune, and fascination. If the spice trade was the lifeblood of medieval Europe, the Arab and Venetian merchants were its beating heart. Without them, the pepper from India, the cinnamon from Ceylon, and the cloves from the Spice Islands would never have made their way to European tables. These merchants were not simply traders, they were master strategists, diplomats, and navigators who turned the movement of spices into a carefully controlled empire of profit. Their power rested on one crucial skill, the ability to control access to the source without revealing too much about it. Knowledge of the routes, the seasons, and the suppliers was as valuable as the spices themselves. For the Arab merchants, geography was destiny. The Arabian Peninsula sat between the riches of the east and the hungry markets of the west, making it the perfect crossroads for trade. From bustling port cities like Aden and Muscat, their ships sailed with the monsoon winds to India, and beyond, loading holds with pepper, ginger, cardamom, and nutmeg. Once back in the Persian Gulf or Red Sea, the cargo would be transferred to camel caravans for the long, grueling trek across desert trade routes. Every leg of the journey was marked by waypoints, oases, where fresh water and security could be found, but where tolls and taxes also had to be paid. In this way, the Arabs maintained both a physical and an economic grip on the spice trade. Their influence went beyond the movement of goods. Arab merchants acted as cultural translators between East and West, carrying not just spices, but also ideas, technologies, and even medical knowledge. They introduced Europeans to new methods of navigation, shipbuilding techniques, and systems of accounting. But they were also careful to guard the secrets of the spice origins. Tales of cinnamon being harvested from nests of giant birds or pepper, collected after driving away venomous snakes, were deliberately spread to protect the true sources. Misinformation was as much a tool as the sword or the coin. On the European side, it was the Venetians who held the final key to unlocking the treasure chest of the spice trade. By the 13th century, Venice had risen as the unrivaled maritime power of the Mediterranean. Its fleets dominated the Adriatic Sea, and its merchants had established exclusive agreements with the Arab traders in Alexandria and other key ports. Venetian ships would arrive in these hubs, take on cargoes of spices, silks, and precious stones, and transport them back to their city. From there, the goods would be resold to traders from all over Europe at a significant markup. In this way, Venice became the primary gateway for Eastern luxuries into the West. The Venetians were as shrewd as their Arab counterparts. They understood that their dominance depended on keeping others dependent on their routes and their prices. They invested heavily in securing their shipping lanes, building fast, heavily armed galleys to deter pirates. They also developed an intricate system of banking and credit that allowed merchants to finance expensive voyages without carrying vast sums of gold, reducing risk while maximizing trade volume. Venetian markets became famous for their abundance and variety, but behind the scenes, supply was carefully managed to keep prices high. The partnership between Arab and Venetian merchants was not without tension, but it was mutually beneficial. The Arabs controlled the flow of goods from the east, and the Venetians controlled the flow into Europe. This chain ensured that the profits remained concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the bottlenecks. While other European powers looked on enviously, few could break into this duopoly without risking war or bankruptcy. It was this very stranglehold that eventually drove explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus to seek direct sea routes to Asia, changing the course of history. In the medieval world, the spice trade was not just commerce. It was a game of controlled secrecy and calculated alliances. The Arab and Venetian merchants were its grandmasters, moving ships and caravans like chess pieces across continents and seas. Every peppercorn, every stick of cinnamon that reached a European table was a small victory in a much larger battle for wealth and influence. And as we'll see, the value of these goods went far beyond taste. They shaped economies, diplomacy, and even the destiny of nations. In the bustling markets of medieval Europe, some spices were so precious that they were treated like currency. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, each was valued not merely for its flavour, but for its rarity, its journey, and the status it conferred upon those who owned it. To the average villager, these spices were almost mythical, spoken of in the same breath as silver or gold. For the nobility, possessing a chest of imported spices was a statement of wealth and influence, something to be displayed as proudly as jewels or fine armour. And unlike gold spices, had a magical quality. They could transform the taste of even the simplest meal. Pepper was the undisputed king of medieval spices. Harvested from the pepper vines of India's Malabar coast, each tiny black bead represented months of labour and thousands of miles of dangerous travel. By the time it reached the markets of London or Paris, its value had multiplied many times over. Pepper was used in everything from roasted meats to sweet pastries, often in amounts that would seem overwhelming to the modern palate. Its cost was so high that it could be used to pay rent, settle debts, or even serve as part of a dowry. Merchants guarded their sacks of pepper as if they contained royal treasure, because in truth they did. Cinnamon was another treasure of the medieval pantry, prized not just for its sweet warm flavour, but for its supposed medicinal properties. Originating from the bark of trees in Ceylon and Southeast Asia, cinnamon's journey to Europe was long and closely guarded by Arab traders. Stories were spread of fierce winged creatures protecting cinnamon groves, a myth designed to keep competitors at bay. In the courts of kings and queens, cinnamon was often reserved for the most lavish feasts, where it might be sprinkled into wine or used to perfume a rich stew. To taste cinnamon was to taste the exotic, an experience beyond the reach of ordinary folk. Cloves and nutmeg, sourced from the remote spice islands of present-day Indonesia, were rarer still. Cloves were used not only in cooking but also in preserving meat, masking unpleasant odours, and even in perfumery. Nutmeg carried with it an almost mystical reputation. Some believed it could ward off the plague, while others saw it as a symbol of luxury fit for royal tables. Because the Spice Islands were so distant and dangerous to reach, the price of these goods in Europe was astronomical. A small pouch of nutmeg could be worth a labourer's entire yearly wage, making it a spice literally worth more than gold by weight. Then there was saffron, the golden thread of medieval cooking. Harvested from the delicate stigma of the crocus flower, saffron was cultivated mainly in the Mediterranean and parts of the Middle East. Each flower produced only a few strands, and thousands were needed to make even a single ounce of spice. Its vivid colour and unique aroma made it a favourite for both cooking and dyeing, adding a golden hue to broths, rice and pastries. Saffron was so valuable that it became the target of theft and fraud, leading to strict laws and harsh punishments for adulteration. These spices did more than flavour food, they flavoured the social and political life of the Middle Ages. To possess them was to demonstrate connection to far-reaching trade networks, wealth, to afford such luxuries, and the sophistication to appreciate them. They were the jewels of the kitchen, the treasures of the table, and the silent markers of power. In many ways they were the engines driving the spice trade itself, motivating merchants, explorers and rulers to risk fortunes and lives in pursuit of the next shipment. For medieval Europe, these were not just seasonings, they were symbols of a world bound together by desire, danger and discovery.
Worth its weight in gold.
In the Middle Ages, spices were not just a matter of taste, they were an economic force powerful enough to shape kingdoms. The movement of pepper, cinnamon, cloves and saffron from distant lands into European markets generated vast amounts of wealth, much of it funneled through layers of taxation and tariffs. Every port, bridge and market town along the way imposed its own fee, each small toll adding to the final price a European buyer would pay. This accumulation of taxes transformed spices into luxury goods, often priced beyond the reach of common citizens. By the time a sack of pepper arrived in a London market, it might cost 10 or 20 times more than its original price in India. The spice trade provided steady revenue streams for rulers who controlled key points along the routes. In the East, sultans and emirs taxed caravans that crossed their deserts, collecting fees in coin or in kind, sometimes taking a share of the goods themselves. In the Mediterranean city-states like Venice and Genoa charged docking fees, market stall rents and export duties. Further inland toll gates on bridges or passes collected payments from merchants transporting spices by wagon or barge. This meant that a single shipment of pepper could be taxed dozens of times before reaching its final destination. Far from discouraging trade, these taxes were accepted as a natural cost of doing business, proof that the cargo was valuable enough to warrant protection and regulation. For medieval rulers, spices were more than just a source of income, they were a tool of diplomacy. Kings and queens often gifted precious spices to foreign ambassadors, cementing alliances and impressing their guests with exotic flavours. In return, they might receive promises of trade privileges, military support, or marriage alliances. Spices also served as a form of tribute vassal states, and conquered territories were sometimes required to send annual shipments of pepper or cinnamon as part of their obligations. In this way, the spice trade became woven into the political fabric of the medieval world, shaping relationships between rulers as much as it shaped the menus in their castles. The economic importance of spices was further amplified by their role in urban markets. In cities like Paris, Bruges, and London, spice merchants were among the wealthiest members of the merchant class. They belonged to powerful guilds that regulated prices, quality, and supply, ensuring that only those who met strict standards could sell. These guilds could influence city policy, secure favourable tax rates for their members, and even lend money to monarchs in times of war. A wealthy spice merchant could rival minor nobility in both influence and lifestyle, hosting lavish feasts, where the abundance of rare seasonings was itself a display of power. Taxes on spices could also take on unique forms. Some regions imposed peppercorn, rent a symbolic payment of a small quantity of pepper, instead of money often written into long-term property leases. This practice, while quaint in appearance, was a reminder of pepper's enduring value as a form of currency. In times of scarcity, spices could also be hoarded by authorities to drive up prices, allowing them to profit when the goods were finally released to the market. Such manipulation often angered consumers but reinforced the idea that spices were precious commodities to be managed like treasure. The cumulative effect of this taxation and controlled distribution was that spices became markers of social class. For the average townsman, the occasional pinch of imported spice was a rare indulgence, perhaps reserved for religious festivals or weddings. For the nobility, however, spices flowed more freely, used liberally in dishes, and even in medicinal preparations. This disparity reinforced social divisions as flavour itself became a privilege of the wealthy. The ability to serve a heavily spiced dish at a feast was not just about taste, it was a declaration of wealth, influence, and access to global trade networks. Yet these high prices and heavy taxes also planted the seeds of change. As European demand grew, so too did frustration with the Venetian and Arab monopolies that dominated the trade. The desire to bypass the endless chain of middlemen and their taxes drove explorers to seek direct sea routes to Asia. In this way, the economic pressures surrounding the spice trade indirectly launched the age of exploration. The voyages of Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, and Ferdinand Magellan all carried the same underlying motive to secure spices at their source, free from the tolls and taxes of the established routes. Thus, the economics of the medieval spice trade was not a static system, but a dynamic engine that fueled ambition, innovation, and expansion. Every coin collected at a market stall, every peppercorn paid as rent, every chest of cinnamon gifted to a king's court contributed to a global network of exchange. Spices were not just commodities, they were catalysts shaping the economic and political landscape of the medieval world in ways that would resonate for centuries. In the medieval world, spices were far more than a way to flavour food, they were a language of prestige, wealth, and influence. To own and use spices freely was to signal that you stood above the struggles of ordinary life. For peasants, daily meals were often bland out of necessity. For the nobility and abundance of exotic flavours was an intentional display of status. A heavily spiced dish was not just a matter of taste, it was a performance, a declaration that the host could afford luxuries that most would never even see. In banquet halls lit by flickering candlelight, the aroma of cinnamon and cloves was as much a marker of rank as the gold embroidery on a noble's cloak. Royal courts in particular used spices as tools of soft power. Feasts served to foreign envoys were carefully designed spectacles where rare spices transformed the simplest dishes into symbols of the realm's prosperity. Roasted meats might be glazed with saffron-infused sauces, pastries dusted with cinnamon and sugar, and wine steeped with ginger or nutmeg. The unspoken message was clear. If we can bring these treasures to our table, imagine the reach of our power. In an age when much of the population lived on bread and pottage, such displays were meant to inspire awe and sometimes intimidation. Spices also held ceremonial importance in religious and state rituals. In certain coronations, rare spices were incorporated into the incense burned during the ceremony, filling the air with scents that were as costly as they were sacred. In churches, cloves and cinnamon might be added to holy oils, linking their exotic origins with divine authority. This blending of the spiritual and the luxurious reinforced the idea that access to spices was not only a sign of worldly power, but also a gift from God. In this way, the nobility and the clergy alike could claim that their wealth and influence were part of a higher order. The symbolic value of spices extended into fashion and personal care. Wealthy individuals sometimes carried spice-filled pomanders, small decorative containers both as a perfume and as a supposed protection against illness. Scented gloves treated with clove oil or cinnamon water were fashionable among the elite, turning the aroma of spices into a kind of wearable status symbol. These fragrant accessories were more than personal indulgences. They were mobile declarations of wealth recognized instantly by anyone within smelling distance. Even the architecture of noble homes reflected the symbolic weight of spices. In some manors and castles, spice cupboards were elaborately carved and displayed in dining halls, not hidden away in kitchens. Guests could see the rows of precious jars and boxes, each labelled and meticulously arranged. The spices themselves were rarely left in plain sight. Many were locked away to prevent theft, but the act of displaying the containers was enough to convey affluence. To be a noble without spices in your household was unthinkable. To be a merchant who could sell to such households was to hold influence that could rival lesser lords. Yet this symbolic use of spices also had a darker side. Excessive displays of wealth through food could breed resentment among the lower classes, who saw such extravagance as a reminder of their own deprivation. In times of famine or war, the lavish use of imported spices could be interpreted as wasteful or even immoral. Chronicles from the period occasionally note tensions at court when nobles competed to outdo one another in opulence. The more valuable the spice, the more it could be used as both a badge of honour and a weapon in the subtle politics of reputation. By the late Middle Ages, spices had become woven into the fabric of social hierarchy itself. They were the edible equivalent of a crown jewel, a means by which the powerful could assert their dominance without speaking a word. Whether scattered over a feast burned in a cathedral or carried in a jewelled pomander, these costly imports served as constant reminders of who held the keys to the world's treasures, and for those who could only dream of such luxuries, the scent alone was enough to conjure visions of distant lands' endless wealth and the unreachable heights of medieval power.
Where flavour becomes pure art.
When we picture medieval cooking, it's easy to imagine huge roasts turning slowly over open fires, or thick stews bubbling in great iron cauldrons. But to truly understand the flavours of the period, we must step into the kitchens of the time places, bustling with activity, fragrant with the mingling scents of meat, herbs, and precious spices. Recipes from medieval cookbooks reveal a world of complex flavours where sweetness, saltiness, and spice often shared the same dish. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate style that reflected both the available ingredients and the culinary ideals of the era. The combination of imported spices with local produce gave medieval food its distinctive character, one that would seem unusual to the modern palate. One of the most common and celebrated dishes among the wealthy was roast meat seasoned with pepper and cinnamon. A large cut of beef venison or game bird would be marinated in a mixture of wine vinegar and crushed peppercorns before roasting. Near the end of cooking, the meat might be glazed with a syrup made from honey and cinnamon, creating a sweet and spicy crust. This balance of sharp pepper heat with warm cinnamon sweetness was considered a mark of sophistication. It also masked any strong flavours in meat that had been stored for long periods, an important practical benefit in a world without refrigeration. Another typical preparation was pottage, a thick stew made with whatever ingredients were available, often served daily in both peasant and noble households. For the wealthy, spices elevated the humble pottage into something more refined. Almond milk, saffron, and ginger might be added, turning a simple vegetable and grain stew into a golden, fragrant dish. The use of saffron in particular was a status statement, as its vivid colour and delicate flavour were unmistakable. In contrast, a poor family's pottage might be seasoned only with herbs like parsley or leeks, leaving spices as a distant luxury. Medieval desserts were equally telling of social class and culinary creativity. A favourite among nobles was marchpane, a confection made from ground almond sugar and rosewater, sometimes spiced with cloves or cinnamon. Served in intricate shapes or painted with gold leaf, it was both a sweet treat and a work of edible art. Another was spiced wine or hippocras, made by infusing red wine with cinnamon, ginger cloves, and sugar. Served warm, it was believed to aid digestion after heavy feasts. These recipes show how spices were not confined to savoury dishes. They were integral to the medieval sweet tooth as well. Fish dishes, especially on religious fasting days, often featured elaborate spice blends. Lamprey pie, for example, combined eel-like fish with a mixture of pepper, saffron, and nutmeg baked in a rich pastry crust. The strong spices balanced the oily taste of the fish, while also helping to preserve it for transport from coastal regions to inland estates. Similarly, pickled herring might be seasoned with mustard seeds, cloves, and bay leaves before being packed into barrels of vinegar. The resulting flavours were both practical for preservation and appealing to those who could afford such imports. One of the most intriguing aspects of medieval recipes is the frequent mixing of meat with sweet elements. Chicken or rabbit in almond and raisin sauce, for example, combined poultry with ground almonds, dried fruits, sugar and spices like ginger and mace. The sauce was rich, slightly sweet and lightly spiced, very different from modern savoury sauces. This blending of flavour profiles came partly from Arab culinary influences brought to Europe through trade and conquest. It also reflected the medieval belief that food should delight the senses in multiple ways, stimulating not just taste but also sight and smell. Cookbooks from the period, such as the Forme of Cury in England or Le Viandier in France, reveal that spice usage was often carefully measured, not because cooks were afraid of overpowering the dish, but because the ingredients were so valuable. Instructions like, take a good quantity of pepper and a little cinnamon were as much about cost as taste. Cooks were trained to balance spices so that no single flavour dominated, creating a layered experience. The end goal was not just nourishment, but also the creation of a dining experience that demonstrated refinement, wealth, and worldly connections. In these kitchens, whether in a castle or a prosperous merchant's home, spices were the magic that transformed simple ingredients into unforgettable dishes. They were proof that the host had access to the farthest reaches of the known world, and they carried with them the stories of deserts crossed, seas navigated, and fortunes made. A medieval recipe was never just a set of cooking instructions. It was a statement of identity, a reflection of trade networks, and a small piece of global history served on a plate. To understand the taste of medieval Europe, we need to set aside our modern idea of flavour combinations. The medieval palate thrived on contrast and intensity, sweetness layered over spice, sourness, balanced with warmth, and sometimes all three in the same dish. This was a world where sugar, still considered a rare luxury, might be used alongside black pepper, or where vinegar and honey could mingle in a sauce for roasted meat. The goal was not subtlety, but complexity, creating flavours that stimulated the senses in unexpected ways. Such combinations reflected both the influence of Eastern cuisines and the desire of European elites to show off their access to exotic imports. One of the most popular pairings was sweet and spicy, achieved through the use of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg and ginger combined with sugar or honey. These spices brought warmth and depth, while the sweetness softened their sharpness, making them suitable for both savoury and sweet dishes. A noble feast might feature a venison roast with a ginger honey glaze or a fruit tart dusted with cinnamon sugar. Even wine was transformed into hypocras by adding sugar, cinnamon and cloves, producing a rich, fragrant drink that signalled refinement. This balance of sweet heat became a signature of medieval cooking, especially in the courts of France and England. Pepper, however, was the undisputed champion of medieval spices, and its flavour dominated many recipes. It was used liberally in meat stews, fish pies, and even in sauces for poultry. Unlike today's black pepper, which we might grind fresh at the table, medieval pepper was often added in larger ground quantities, producing a bold and sometimes fiery result. Its pungent heat was not only appealing to the taste, but also practical. It helped disguise the flavour of preserved or less than fresh meat. Because pepper was so expensive, its heavy use in a dish was a clear sign of wealth, much like wearing silk or gold. Saffron offered another defining taste of the era, prized as much for its golden colour as for its subtle honeyed flavour. It was used to brighten the appearance of rice dishes, sauces and broths, turning even simple meals into golden feasts for the eyes, as well as the palate. Its aroma was delicate yet distinctive, and it often paired with ginger or cinnamon in high-status recipes. Beyond taste, saffron carried medicinal associations believed to improve mood, aid digestion, and even prolong life. The combination of visual beauty, gentle flavour and symbolic power made it one of the most coveted spices of the medieval kitchen. Ginger played a surprisingly versatile role, used fresh when available, but more often in its dried form imported from Asia. It brought a bright, slightly sweet heat that could cut through the richness of fatty meats or cream-based sauces. Ginger was common in both savoury and sweet contexts. It could season a roast goose one day and flavour a batch of sweet gingerbread the next. In an age when most people had never heard of citrus fruit, ginger offered a similar refreshing sharpness. It was also valued for its supposed medicinal qualities, believed to warm the body and protect against illness in cold seasons. Finally, herbs and local flavourings rounded out the medieval flavour palette, while exotic spices captured the imagination. Fresh and dried herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme were widely available and heavily used. They offered a green, earthy freshness that complemented the richer imported seasonings. Mustard seeds were another common flavouring, often ground into a sharp paste mixed with vinegar to accompany meats. These locally sourced flavours were affordable for most households, creating a foundation that could be elevated by the addition of precious imports in wealthier kitchens. Together, these flavours created a culinary identity that was both local and global. A single medieval dish might feature homegrown herbs from a garden just steps away from the kitchen, combined with spices that had travelled thousands of miles across deserts and seas. The result was a style of cooking that celebrated abundance, variety, and contrast, each bite a small demonstration of the interconnected world of the Middle Ages. To taste medieval food was to taste not just the ingredients, but the journeys, the trade and the ambition that brought them to the table. If a medieval cook were transported into a modern kitchen, they might be both amazed and confused by the flavours we consider normal today. In the Middle Ages, the idea of seasoning meat with sugar or adding cinnamon to fish was not unusual. It was desirable. Today, most Western cuisines separate sweet and savoury far more strictly, a shift influenced by changing trade patterns, evolving culinary philosophies, and the industrialisation of food. Where medieval feasts sought complexity through layers of sweet, sour, and spicy in a single dish, modern cooking often favours cleaner, more distinct flavour profiles. This difference means that many medieval recipes would taste surprisingly unfamiliar, even when using ingredients we still know well. One of the most striking contrasts is the use of spices themselves. In medieval Europe, black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron were used generously in both savoury and sweet dishes, and their presence signalled status as much as taste. Today, pepper is commonplace and affordable, while cinnamon is largely confined to sweet foods in Western kitchens. Saffron remains expensive, but it is used sparingly, more for its colour and aroma than for displaying wealth. Nutmeg and cloves, once key players in meat dishes, are now more likely to be found in desserts or holiday drinks. This shift reflects not just changing tastes, but also the democratization of spices. What was once rare is now available in every supermarket. The modern palate also leans more heavily on ingredients that were rare or unknown in medieval Europe. Tomatoes, potatoes, chili peppers, and vanilla, all products of the Americas, were absent from European cooking until after the Columbian Exchange in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Their arrival fundamentally reshaped flavour traditions, replacing or reducing the use of certain Old World spices in everyday cooking. Medieval recipes, with their heavy reliance on spice blends like poudre douce or poudre forte, gave way to simpler seasonings and the bold flavours of New World crops. The result is that a modern stew or sauce might be richer in vegetables but less complex in spice layering than its medieval counterpart. Some medieval combinations, however, survive in unexpected places. The pairing of sweet and savoury can still be found in Moroccan tagines, certain Asian dishes, and even in holiday classics like glazed ham or cranberry sauce served with turkey. Spiced wine has a modern descendant in mulled wine still enjoyed in winter across Europe. The use of herbs alongside spices, so central to medieval cooking, continues in many regional cuisines, though today's cooks might favour fresh herbs over the dried ones more common in the past. These echoes remind us that while tastes evolve, culinary traditions rarely vanish completely, they adapt. In the end, the comparison between medieval and modern cooking is not just about ingredients, but about cultural meaning. In the Middle Ages, spices were status symbols, storytelling devices, and connections to the wider world. Today, they are everyday items available to almost everyone and valued more for their sensory contribution than for what they represent. Yet every time we add a pinch of cinnamon to a savoury stew, or a thread of saffron to a broth, we unknowingly touch a piece of that medieval world a reminder that the flavours of the past still linger in the kitchens of the present.
Preserving life, one season ahead.
In the Middle Ages, salt was far more than a seasoning, it was a lifeline. Known as white gold, it was one of the most valuable commodities in Europe, prized for its ability to preserve food long before refrigeration existed. Without salt, armies could not march, ships could not sail on long voyages, and households could not survive the lean months between harvests. Its importance stretched far beyond the kitchen, touching every aspect of medieval life from economics and politics to religion. For many communities, controlling a source of salt was as vital as controlling a fortress or a fertile field. The value of salt came from its unique ability to draw moisture out of food, creating an environment where bacteria and fungi could not thrive. Meat and fish in particular could be stored for months sometimes, even years when salted properly. This meant that hunting or fishing could be done in large quantities when conditions were good, and the surplus could be preserved for times when fresh food was scarce. In coastal towns, barrels of salted herring cod or mackerel became staples of trade shipped inland to feed entire cities. In the countryside, families salted pork or beef in great wooden tubs, knowing that this preparation could carry them through the harshest winters. Salt production took many forms depending on geography. Along coastlines, sea salt was harvested by evaporating seawater in large, shallow pans, a labour-intensive process that relied heavily on sunny, dry weather. In inland regions, salt was mined from underground deposits brought to the surface as rock salt, or dissolved in water and boiled away. Some of the most famous medieval salt sources, such as the mines at Salzburg in Austria or Wieliczka in Poland, were so profitable that they funded the rise of entire cities. Controlling these resources often sparked political disputes, and rulers jealously guarded their rights to tax or monopolise the salt trade. The economic role of salt was immense. In France, the gabelle, a royal tax on salt, became one of the crown's most controversial sources of income. This tax ensured that everyone, regardless of wealth, contributed to the royal coffers, since salt was a necessity for all. Merchants who traded salt often grew wealthy, and some cities became known as salt towns, thriving entirely on this commerce. Caravans of mules or wagons loaded with sacks of salt were a common sight along medieval trade routes, moving slowly but steadily between ports, mines, and markets. Salt also carried cultural and symbolic weight. In many medieval households, salt was placed at the centre of the table, during meals a position of honour reflecting its value. To be seated above the salt in a great hall meant sitting closer to the Lord and sharing in the higher status of the honoured guests. Those below the salt were of lower rank. In religious contexts, salt was sometimes used in baptismal rites, or as a symbol of purity and preservation. It also appeared in superstitions. Spilling salt was considered bad luck, and customs for countering the omens, such as throwing a pinch over one's shoulder, date back centuries. In cooking, salt's role was both practical and transformative. It not only preserved food, but also enhanced its flavour, making even simple dishes more palatable. Salted meats, once soaked to remove excess salt, could be boiled with vegetables to create hearty stews. Fish preserved in salt retained a firm texture and strong taste suitable for frying or baking. Even dairy products benefited from salt. Cheeses were rubbed with brine or packed in salt to prevent spoilage, and butter could be salted to last longer without turning rancid. This versatility made salt indispensable across all levels of society. Yet for all its benefits, salt was never truly abundant in the medieval world. Harvesting it required specific conditions, substantial labour, and careful storage, which kept its price high. For the poor, salt was often used sparingly, and oversalting could be seen as wasteful or ostentatious. For the wealthy, however, the generous use of salt was another way to display status, much like the use of exotic spices. At a grand feast, dishes seasoned liberally with salt signalled that the host could afford not just the basic necessity, but the luxury of abundance. Ultimately, salt's reputation as white gold was well earned. It sustained armies, fueled economies, inspired laws, and shaped cultures. Its trade connected distant regions from the salt pans of the Mediterranean to the markets of northern Europe. In a very real sense, salt preserved not only food, but also the rhythms of medieval life itself, ensuring survival in an age where nature's challenges were met with ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the enduring value of a single humble mineral. While salt was the foundation of medieval food preservation, smoking and drying were equally important techniques, especially in regions where salt was expensive or difficult to obtain. These methods relied on natural processes, air heat, and time turning fresh food into durable supplies that could last through the long winter months. They also shaped the flavour of medieval diets, adding distinctive smoky or concentrated tastes that many people came to associate with nourishment and survival. For households without access to bustling trade routes, these methods were often the difference between a full pantry and an empty table. Smoking served a dual purpose. It preserved food and gave it a rich, savoury flavour. Meat or fish would be hung in a smokehouse or over a hearth, where slow-burning wood created a steady stream of aromatic smoke. The smoke acted as a preservative by coating the surface with antimicrobial compounds while gently drying out the food. Different woods were chosen for their flavours: oak for a strong hearty taste, apple wood for a sweeter note, and beech for a mild, balanced aroma. Over days or even weeks, the food would develop a firm texture and deep colour ready to be stored for months. In many rural communities, the smokehouse was a central feature of village life. Families would work together during the peak of the hunting or fishing season, processing large quantities of meat or fish to be smoked in shared facilities. The scent of smoking food drifting through the air was a familiar sign that the community was preparing for the leaner months ahead. This cooperative approach not only made preservation more efficient, but also reinforced social bonds. Neighbours relied on each other's skills, labour, and shared resources. Drying, on the other hand, depended on the removal of moisture through exposure to air and, when possible, sunlight. In coastal regions, fish like cod and herring were cleaned split and laid out on wooden racks to dry in the sea breeze. Inland fruits such as apples, plums, and figs might be sliced and spread on cloths, or strung up in warm, dry attics. Meat could also be air-dried, often after being salted to ensure a longer shelf life. Drying was labour-intensive, requiring vigilance to keep insects, rodents, and sudden rain from ruining the harvest. But when done well, it produced food that could last for months without spoiling. The choice between smoking and drying often depended on climate and resources. In damp or cold regions where natural air drying was unreliable, smoking offered a more controlled environment. In hot arid climates, drying was faster and less labour-intensive, requiring only racks and good weather. Some households even combined the two methods, partially drying meat, before finishing it in the smokehouse to maximise preservation. This flexibility allowed medieval communities to adapt to seasonal changes and environmental challenges, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Both smoking and drying transformed the flavour and texture of food in ways that were prized in medieval cuisine. Smoked hams, dried sausages, and salted and dried fish were not seen as inferior to fresh food. In many cases, they were delicacies in their own right. The concentrated flavours of dried fruit made them a luxury addition to pies, stews, or sweetmeats, while smoked meats added depth to soups and porridges. These preserved foods also travelled well, making them valuable for merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims who needed reliable provisions on long journeys. In the medieval world, preserving food was not simply a matter of survival, it was an art form. Smoking and drying required careful attention to timing, weather, and technique, and the best practitioners were highly respected in their communities. The methods may have been simple, but they represented generations of accumulated knowledge passed down from one household to the next. In every slice of smoked ham or handful of dried apples, there was a story of resourcefulness, cooperation, and the enduring human effort to make the harvest last until the next season's bounty. When we compare medieval preservation methods with those used today, the differences are as striking as they are revealing. In the Middle Ages, techniques like salting, smoking, and drying were born out of necessity developed over centuries to keep food edible, through long winters or lengthy journeys. Today, refrigeration, freezing, and vacuum sealing have largely replaced these older methods, offering faster, more reliable results. Yet the flavours and textures produced by traditional preservation still hold a unique appeal, which is why smoked meats, dried fruits and pickled vegetables remain popular even when they're no longer essential for survival. In many ways, what was once a matter of life and death has become a matter of taste and tradition. One of the biggest changes is the accessibility of preservation. In the medieval world, proper salting required both skill and a steady supply of quality salt, something not all communities could afford. Smoking demanded dedicated space-time, and a supply of suitable wood while drying relied heavily on the cooperation of the weather. Modern technology has eliminated many of these constraints, allowing almost anyone to preserve food with minimal effort and equipment. Freezers and refrigerators not only extend the shelf life of fresh produce, but also make seasonal foods available year-round, fundamentally altering the rhythm of eating and cooking. Flavour expectations have also shifted. Medieval preserved foods often had stronger, more pronounced tastes. Salted meats were noticeably salty. Smoked fish carried a deep woody aroma, and dried fruits were intensely sweet and chewy. These qualities were embraced, even celebrated, in a time when such flavours were tied to preservation itself. In contrast, modern consumers often seek preserved products that taste as close to fresh as possible, with milder seasoning and textures. The shift reflects both technological capability and cultural preference, as freshness has become the ultimate culinary ideal in the modern age. However, traditional preservation has not vanished. It has transformed into an artisanal craft. Many contemporary chefs and home cooks intentionally revive medieval techniques, not for necessity, but for the unique character they bring to food. Smoked cheeses, air-dried hams and barrel-aged pickles are marketed as premium products, often fetching high prices. This mirrors the medieval reality in a curious way, while the reasons for their value have changed. These preserved goods are still associated with skill quality, and sometimes exclusivity. It is a reminder that preservation, whether ancient or modern, carries a cultural weight beyond mere storage. In the end, the comparison reveals a fascinating continuity. Modern preservation methods may be faster and more precise, but they cannot fully replicate the depth of flavour, the communal rituals, or the seasonal rhythms of the medieval approach. Just as medieval households planned their year around the need to store food for the lean months, modern food culture still marks time with seasonal specialties: holiday hams, summer smoked fish, autumn preserves. In both worlds, the act of preserving food is as much about memory and identity as it is about sustenance, connecting the tables of today to the hearths of the distant past.
Two worlds, one medieval table.
To dine at a nobleman's table in the Middle Ages was to enter a world of deliberate spectacle. Meals were more than sustenance. They were public displays of wealth, refinement, and power. Every course, every spice, and every vessel was chosen to impress guests and reinforce the host's status. A feast might last for hours, with music, poetry, and pageantry accompanying the steady stream of food from the kitchens. Servants carried platters of delicacies into the great hall, each one designed to be as visually striking as it was flavourful. In this setting, the menu was as much about storytelling as it was about taste. A typical noble menu began with entremets dishes served between courses that were often decorative or symbolic. These could include meat pies shaped like castles, roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached, or elaborately painted sugar sculptures. The goal was not just to feed, but to amaze, turning the meal into a kind of edible theatre. Soups and broths might follow, often richly seasoned with saffron, cinnamon, and ginger, signalling the host's access to the spice trade. Even the bread was a mark of privilege, fine white loaves made from carefully sifted wheat flour in stark contrast to the coarse dark bread eaten by commoners. Meat was the centrepiece of noble dining, and variety was the rule. Venison bore swan pheasant, and even exotic animals like cranes or herons could appear on the table. These were roasted, boiled, or baked into pastries, often served with complex sauces made from wine vinegar, sugar, and imported spices. Fish was equally lavish on fasting days, with sturgeon, salmon, and eel prepared in multiple ways. The richness of these dishes reflected not just the resources of the host's estate, but also the network of trade and tribute that supplied the castle kitchens. Side dishes and accompaniments were far from simple. Vegetables were usually served in highly seasoned sauces such as leeks, stewed with almond milk, or carrots cooked with honey and ginger. Salads, when they appeared, might include herbs, edible flowers, and fruits dressed with vinegar and oil imported from Mediterranean regions. The combination of sweet and savoury flavours was deliberate, echoing the culinary ideals of balance and contrast, prized in the noble kitchens of France, England, and Italy. Even seemingly humble ingredients were elevated with the addition of spices like cloves or nutmeg, transforming them into luxury items. Desserts provided another opportunity for display. Marchpane marzipan shaped into intricate designs, jellies moulded in bright colours, and spiced wafers served with hippocras were all common finales to a noble feast. Fruit when in season might be served fresh, but more often it was dried, candied, or preserved in honey methods that extended its availability and intensified its sweetness. These sweet courses were not merely an indulgence. They reinforced the image of the host as a connoisseur with access to the most refined luxuries of the age. The order and pacing of these meals were carefully managed. Dishes were brought out in removes or courses with the most impressive items, often appearing in the middle rather than at the start. This created a rhythm of surprise and satisfaction, ensuring that the guests' attention and admiration never waned. Music, poetry recitals, or even small performances might accompany the serving of certain dishes, especially during grand feasts marking weddings, victories, or royal visits. In such settings, the food became part of a larger narrative about the host's generosity, influence, and mastery of the social arts. To eat like a nobleman in the Middle Ages was to participate in a highly choreographed ritual. Every bite was shaped by the politics of status, the economics of trade, and the cultural ideals of refinement. The noble table was a place where flavours from across the known world met where artistry and abundance merged, and where the act of eating was elevated to a performance. For those seated above the salt, the meal was a reminder of their privileged position. For those below it was a glimpse into a world that few could ever hope to enter. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, meals were simple, repetitive, and dictated by the seasons. Unlike the nobility, peasants had no access to exotic spices or elaborate feasts. Their diet centred on what could be grown, gathered, or preserved locally with occasional additions from hunting, fishing, or small-scale trade. Bread, pottage, and ale formed the backbone of their meals, offering sustenance if not variety. The focus was on survival and practicality rather than indulgence or display. Bread was the single most important staple, but it was a far cry from the fine white loaves found in noble halls. Most peasants ate coarse dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats, often mixed with bran or peas to stretch the flour. In poorer years, bread might be padded out with acorns or chestnuts, producing a heavier, more bitter loaf. Baking was done in communal ovens when available, or on simple flat stones near the hearth. Because grain was precious, bread was eaten slowly and sparingly, often forming the base for other foods like pottage or broth. Pottage itself was the daily meal for many. This thick stew of grains, beans, and vegetables could be endlessly varied depending on what was available. In summer, it might be bright with fresh greens, leeks, and herbs. In winter, it would be heavier, relying on stored root vegetables, dried legumes, and the occasional scrap of salted meat or bacon fat for flavour. Cooking was done in a single pot over the fire, and the pottage might simmer all day, feeding the household at different times. It was humble, filling, and designed to make the most of limited resources. Meat was a rarity for most peasants, reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, or as payment in kind from a lord. When it was available, it was often preserved salted pork, smoked fish, or dried sausage rather than fresh. Hunting was heavily restricted by law, with game reserved for the nobility, so peasants relied on small animals like rabbits, chickens, or ducks, which could be kept and slaughtered as needed. Eggs, milk, and cheese were more common sources of protein, though even these might be sold at market for cash rather than consumed at home. Seasonality shaped every aspect of the peasant diet. Fresh fruits like apples, pears, and berries were enjoyed in summer and autumn, but quickly preserved through drying or storing in cool cellars. Cabbage, onions, and turnips were hardy enough to last into winter, while herbs were dried in bunches to flavour food during the lean months. Salt was precious and used sparingly, meaning that many preserved foods relied more on drying or fermenting. This frugality ensured survival, but often left the diet monotonous, especially at the end of winter when stores ran low. Despite its simplicity, the peasant diet was often healthier than the noble one in terms of nutrition. While nobles indulged in heavy meats and sugar-laden treats, peasants consumed more grains, vegetables and legumes. Their meals were naturally high in fibre and lower in fat, though they lacked the variety and micronutrients that imported foods could provide. For peasants, food was never just a pleasure. It was the result of daily labour, the measure of a good harvest, and the most direct link between survival and the land they worked. The contrast between the diets of nobles and peasants in the Middle Ages was as stark as the difference between their living conditions. Nobles enjoyed a wide variety of meats, exotic spices and refined breads, while peasants relied on coarse grains, legumes and seasonal vegetables. This disparity was not simply about taste, it reflected access to resources, trade networks and labour. The noble diet offered abundance and variety, but it also carried hidden drawbacks. The peasant diet, though limited and repetitive, sometimes provided more balanced nutrition than the feasts of the elite. One of the most obvious differences was protein consumption. Nobles could eat fresh or preserved meat daily, often in large quantities, supplemented by rich sauces and sweetened dishes. Peasants, by contrast, might go weeks without meat, relying instead on dairy products, eggs, or occasional fish. While this meant the noble diet was higher in protein and fat, it also came with increased cholesterol and a heavier caloric load. For peasants, lower meat consumption reduced these risks, but limited access to animal protein could also lead to deficiencies over time. Micronutrient intake also varied between the classes. Nobles had access to imported goods such as citrus fruits, almonds, figs, and dates, all of which added vitamins and minerals to their meals. Peasants' diets were shaped entirely by what could be grown locally or stored without costly preservation methods. Root vegetables, cabbage, and onions provided some vitamins, but long winters often meant months with little fresh produce. This could lead to ailments such as scurvy or general malnutrition, especially in years of poor harvest. Ironically, the heavy meat-rich, noble diet sometimes caused its own health problems. Gout, often called the disease of kings, was linked to excessive consumption of red meat, game and rich wines. Dental decay was also more common among the wealthy, who could afford sugar and sweetened confections, while peasants who rarely consumed sugar often had better overall dental health. The noble preference for heavily spiced and salted foods could mask spoilage, but it also encouraged overindulgence in highly seasoned dishes. In terms of daily energy, the peasant diet was often better suited to the demands of physical labour. Meals built around bread, pottage and ale provided slow-burning carbohydrates and hydration for long hours in the fields. Noble meals, heavy with fats and refined flours, were more appropriate for sedentary lifestyles centred on governance hunting or ceremonial duties. The irony is that while peasants ate to work, nobles often worked to eat, hunting, feasting and entertaining as part of their social role. Ultimately, the nutritional divide mirrored the broader social structure of the Middle Ages. Nobles had more choice, but not necessarily better health, while peasants had less choice, but sometimes a sturdier constitution. Food was a marker of class as much as clothing or land ownership, and the gap between the two diets reflected centuries of inequality. Yet both groups were bound by the same agricultural rhythms, relying on the harvest preservation techniques and the skills of those who prepared their meals. In this way, food remained a shared, if unequal, thread in the fabric of medieval life.
The hidden science of survival.
In the Middle Ages, people understood how to preserve food through experience and tradition, but they did not yet know the scientific principles behind their methods. Today we can explain why techniques like salting, smoking and fermenting worked so well using the language of chemistry and microbiology. At the heart of all preservation is one central idea: preventing the growth of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that cause spoilage. This can be done by removing the conditions these microbes need, such as moisture, oxygen, or favourable temperatures, or by creating an environment that is toxic to them. Medieval cooks may not have spoken of water activity or pH levels, but their practical knowledge achieved the same result. Salting was one of the most powerful preservation tools, and its effectiveness comes from its ability to draw water out of food and microorganisms alike. Salt causes osmosis, pulling moisture from cells and creating an environment too dry for bacteria to survive. This dehydration, combined with a high concentration of salt, also disrupts the enzymes microbes need to function, essentially halting their growth. In medieval Europe, meats and fish were often packed in layers of salt or soaked in brine, a solution of salt in water, to ensure that every surface was protected. The process could be adjusted depending on the desired storage time: more salt for long journeys, less for foods meant to be eaten sooner. Smoking worked in part because of heat, but more importantly because of the chemicals present in wood smoke. When wood burns slowly, it releases compounds like phenols, formaldehyde, and organic acids. These substances coat the surface of the food, creating an antimicrobial barrier and slowing oxidation, which is the process that turns fats rancid. The gentle heat also reduces the moisture content, much like salting does, adding a second layer of protection. Medieval smokehouses were designed to keep the temperature low enough to avoid cooking the meat, while still allowing the smoke to penetrate deeply. This combination of dehydration and chemical coating gave smoked foods both a long shelf life and a distinctive flavour. Drying, whether in the sun, the wind, or by a fire, is perhaps the simplest form of preservation from a scientific perspective. Microorganisms require water to grow, and by removing it you remove their ability to multiply. In dry environments, enzymes within the food that can cause spoilage also become inactive. For medieval people living in arid climates, drying fruit grains and even meat was an efficient way to make harvests last well beyond their season. In wetter regions, drying was often combined with other methods, light salting, before hanging fish or meat. To air dry was common in northern Europe. Fermentation, though less understood scientifically at the time, relied on controlling microbial growth in a different way, by encouraging good microbes to outcompete harmful ones. In fermenting vegetables, lactic acid bacteria convert sugars into lactic acid, lowering the pH and creating an acidic environment that dangerous bacteria cannot tolerate. Similarly, in brewing beer or making wine, yeast converts sugars into alcohol, which acts as a preservative. These processes were part of daily life in the Middle Ages, even if people thought of them in terms of tradition and taste rather than microbiology. Fermentation not only preserved food, but also improved its nutritional value and digestibility. Vinegar preservation works on a similar principle to fermentation, but with a direct focus on acidity. Acetic acid, the main component of vinegar, lowers the pH of food to a level where most spoilage organisms cannot grow. Pickling in vinegar was common for vegetables, fruits, and even some meats, particularly in regions with easy access to wine or cider production. In addition to its preservative qualities, vinegar added a tangy flavour that complemented the medieval taste for contrasts: sharpness balanced by sweetness or spice. The combination of acidity, reduced moisture, and sometimes salt made pickled food some of the safest and longest lasting in a medieval pantry. These natural chemical mechanisms, dehydration, salt-induced osmotic pressure, smoke-derived antimicrobials, acidification, and alcohol production, formed the invisible foundation of medieval preservation. Without knowing the exact science, people learned to manipulate their environment to protect their food from decay. Today we understand these processes in detail, allowing us to reproduce them with precision and even improve upon them. Yet the principles remain the same. To keep food safe, you must make it unwelcoming to the organisms that would destroy it. In that way, modern kitchens and medieval smokehouses share the same goal, though separated by centuries of scientific discovery. Preservation in the Middle Ages was far from foolproof. While techniques like salting, smoking, and fermenting could extend the life of food, mistakes in their application could lead to spoilage or worse, foodborne illness. Without the benefit of modern microbiology, people often judged food by smell, taste, or appearance, which could be dangerously misleading. In some cases, preserved foods harboured invisible threats such as bacteria or toxins that survived despite the preservation process. The result could range from mild stomach trouble to deadly poisoning, and the causes were often mysterious to medieval minds. One common issue arose from inadequate salting. If meat or fish was not fully covered with salt, or if the brine was too weak, pockets of moisture could allow bacteria to flourish. In warmer weather, this risk increased dramatically as heat sped up microbial growth. Spoiled salted fish might develop a slimy texture or an unpleasant odour, but these signs were not always obvious once the food was cooked. In extreme cases, such contamination could lead to severe illness, especially in communities that relied heavily on preserved foods during fasting periods, when meat consumption was restricted. Smoking also carried risks when done improperly. If the temperature in the smokehouse was too low, it might fail to dry the food adequately, leaving it vulnerable to mold or bacterial growth. Conversely, excessive heat could partially cook the meat without fully preserving it, creating a false sense of safety. Certain molds could produce toxins, and while medieval people may not have understood the chemistry, they sometimes linked illness to bad or unclean smoke. The choice of wood mattered too. Resinous woods could impart unpleasant flavours or harmful substances to the food if used in large quantities. Fermentation, though often safe when done correctly, could turn dangerous if the balance of good microbes was disrupted. A poorly sealed fermenting vessel might admit unwanted bacteria or mould, spoiling the batch. In some cases, the result could be harmful to consume, though fermentation failures were more often unpleasant than deadly. Alcoholic beverages carried their own hazards. Weakly brewed or contaminated beer could sour quickly, and in rare cases molds growing in damp grain stores could introduce toxins that made entire communities sick. Botulism caused by Clostridium botulinum was a particularly dangerous but little understood threat. This bacterium thrives in low oxygen environments such as inside improperly stored meats or sealed containers. While rare cases of sudden paralysis or death from eating preserved foods may well have been caused by botulism, though medieval people would have blamed such events on bad humours, curses, or divine punishment. Without refrigeration, controlling the exact conditions inside storage vessels was nearly impossible, making certain preservation experiments risky. In the medieval world, food preservation was a careful balance between skill luck and environmental conditions. A well-salted ham or perfectly smoked fish could feed a family for months. A poorly preserved one could bring sickness or death. These dangers were a constant reminder that preservation was both an art and a gamble, one that demanded vigilance at every stage. Today, with modern science and safety standards, the same methods can be applied with far greater control, but the lessons of the past still remind us that nature's rules must be respected if we want our food to nourish rather than harm.
Flavors time chose to forget.
Not every spice that flavoured medieval dishes has survived into the modern pantry. Some once commanded high prices and travelled thousands of miles to reach European tables, only to fade into obscurity in the centuries that followed. These lost spices are a reminder that taste is shaped as much by culture and trade as by the natural world. When supply routes shifted, empires fell, or new flavours arrived. Certain seasonings simply slipped out of common use. Their absence today makes them all the more intriguing for historians and chefs seeking to recreate the flavours of the past. One such spice was long pepper, Piper longum, closely related to black pepper, but hotter and more complex in flavour. In the Middle Ages, it was as prized as its cousin, and often used interchangeably in recipes. Its slightly sweet, earthy heat added depth to meat dishes, sauces, and even spiced wines. But as trade in black pepper expanded and prices dropped, long pepper lost its advantage. By the early modern period, it had all but disappeared from European markets, surviving mainly in parts of India and Southeast Asia, where it is still appreciated today. Another vanished favourite was grains of paradise, Aphramomum melegueta, a peppery citrusy seed from West Africa. This spice was brought to Europe by Arab and later Portuguese traders, finding a place in medieval cooking as a cheaper alternative to black pepper. It appeared in everything from meat pies to beer, giving a bright, slightly floral heat. But as black pepper became more affordable, grains of paradise were pushed aside. By the 17th century they were largely forgotten in European kitchens, though they have seen a small revival in modern craft brewing and experimental cooking. Cubeb pepper, Piper cubeba was another exotic import notable for its pungent aroma and hint of bitterness. Originating in Java and other parts of Indonesia, it was imported by Arab merchants and used in savoury dishes, spice syrups, and medicinal preparations. Cubeb was believed to aid digestion and freshen breath, making it both a culinary and a social asset. However, when the Portuguese gained control of the spice trade, they restricted cubeb exports to promote other more profitable products. As a result, cubeb vanished from most European markets, lingering only in apothecaries, before fading almost entirely from memory. One of the more unusual forgotten spices was mastic, a resin from the mastic tree native to the island of Chios in the Aegean Sea. In medieval times, it was chewed like gum used to flavour syrups and incorporated into both sweet and savoury dishes. Its pine-like, slightly sweet taste was unlike anything else in the medieval kitchen. Mastic's decline was due in part to its specialised growing conditions and the rise of alternative flavourings. Today it survives mainly in Greek and Middle Eastern cuisines, but its role in European cooking is a shadow of what it once was. These forgotten spices tell a story not just of changing tastes, but of shifting worlds. The age of exploration brought new flavours, chili peppers, vanilla allspice that altered European cooking forever. Some medieval favourites could not compete with these newcomers, whether because they were harder to cultivate, more expensive to ship, or simply less appealing to changing palates. To recreate a true medieval feast today, one must search for these lost spices, tracking them down in specialty markets or ordering them from distant lands. In doing so, we catch a glimpse of the vast interconnected web of trade and culture that once made them common and perhaps taste for a moment the forgotten flavours of the Middle Ages. In recent years, a quiet revival has been taking place in the world of spices. Chefs, historians, and adventurous home cooks have begun seeking out the flavours that once graced medieval tables, but later vanished from common use. This movement is partly driven by historical reenactment groups and culinary researchers determined to recreate authentic dishes from centuries past. It is also fueled by a broader trend toward artisanal and heritage ingredients, where the story behind the spice is as important as the taste itself. In an era of global trade and online marketplaces, even the rarest seasonings can be sourced with relative ease compared to the past. Long pepper, for instance, has reappeared on the shelves of specialty spice shops marketed as a bold alternative to black pepper. Its sweet heat and complex aroma have caught the attention of modern chefs who use it in everything from steak rubs to chocolate desserts. Similarly, grains of paradise have found a niche in craft brewing where their peppery citrus bite adds depth to ales and stouts. These spices are no longer bound to the exclusive world of the medieval elite. They are accessible to anyone curious enough to experiment. Cubeb pepper is experiencing a smaller but notable comeback, often in the context of fusion cuisine. Some high-end restaurants use it to create sauces with an exotic twist, while a few distillers have begun incorporating it into gin for its distinctive aroma. The spice's history, once prized, then deliberately suppressed, adds an element of intrigue that appeals to modern food enthusiasts. Similarly, mastic is enjoying renewed attention in the fields of pastry and confectionery, especially in Mediterranean-inspired bakeries. Its resinous sweetness lends a unique signature to ice creams, custards, and syrups, bridging the gap between ancient tradition and contemporary taste. This revival is not just about novelty. It is also about reclaiming biodiversity and culinary heritage. For centuries, global agriculture has focused on a narrow range of commercially dominant spices, leaving many traditional varieties on the brink of extinction. By reintroducing these forgotten flavours, growers and traders help preserve cultural traditions and ecological diversity. For cooks, using them is a way to tell a story, a connection to the merchants, sailors, and farmers who once carried these treasures across oceans and deserts. In the kitchens of today, the return of these spices is less about status and more about curiosity. Medieval Europe valued them as symbols of wealth. Modern chefs prize them as tools for creativity. By blending ancient flavours with contemporary techniques, the modern revival breathes new life into the spice trade's long and winding history. It allows us to experience the past not as something distant and dusty, but as something we can taste, smell, and share just as people did hundreds of years ago.
The past still feeds us.
The Middle Ages left us more than just stories of knights and castles. They also left a legacy of food preservation techniques that still hold value today. Methods like drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting are not only effective, but also environmentally sustainable. They require little to no electricity, making them ideal for energy-conscious living, or remote areas where modern refrigeration is unavailable. Beyond practicality, these methods create distinctive flavors: smoky hams, tangy sauerkraut, richly salted fish that continue to inspire chefs and home cooks alike. In many ways, the medieval kitchen anticipated today's enthusiasm for artisanal and organic food, where process and taste are equally celebrated. However, not everything from the medieval pantry should be revived without adaptation. Preservation then often suffered from limited hygiene standards, inconsistent techniques, and a lack of nutritional diversity. Improperly salted meat, poorly dried fish, or contaminated fermentation vessels could easily cause illness. Diets, especially for the poor, were monotonous and sometimes deficient in essential vitamins, leading to long-term health problems. Modern technology offers solutions: controlled temperatures, vacuum sealing, and microbial testing can be combined with traditional methods to make them safer and more reliable. Adjusting seasoning levels, reducing excess salt, and overly strong spice blends can also make preserved foods healthier for modern tastes. Blending past and present offers exciting possibilities for both cooks and eaters. Medieval spice combinations, pepper with cinnamon, ginger with saffron, can be adapted to contemporary dishes, creating a living history experience on the plate. Imagine roasted vegetables with a medieval-inspired spice rub, or fresh seafood paired with a sauce based on recipes from centuries ago. New global ingredients, from South American chili peppers to tropical fruits, can complement these historic flavors, enriching the nutritional profile while honoring tradition. The result is food that is both familiar and novel, grounded in heritage, yet open to the world's bounty. Ultimately, the lessons from the medieval table remind us that food is more than fuel, it is culture, connection, and continuity. The techniques our ancestors used to survive can be refined to help us thrive, offering sustainable, flavorful, and memorable meals. By preserving the knowledge of the past and blending it with the innovations of the present, we can ensure that our culinary heritage remains vibrant and relevant. In this way, the food on our tables becomes both a piece of history and a promise for the future, a reminder that eating well is an art that transcends time.
History's flavor lingers beyond time.
We've journeyed from the spice gardens of India and the bustling markets of Venice to the smoke-filled kitchens and storerooms of medieval Europe. Along the way, we've seen how something as small as a peppercorn, or as delicate as a thread of saffron, could influence trade routes, shape political alliances, and alter the very structure of society. We've stepped inside the kitchens of nobles, where spices were as much a display of wealth as they were a seasoning, and into the humble homes of peasants, where preservation methods meant survival through long, harsh winters. Through these stories, we've uncovered not only the flavors of the Middle Ages, but also the ingenuity, risk, and ambition that brought them to the table. We've explored the science behind preservation: salt drawing out moisture, smoke layering food with protective compounds, and fermentation creating safe, nourishing meals through the work of invisible microbes. We've learned how these techniques kept armies marching, ships sailing, and villages fed, even when fresh food was months or oceans away. We've also discovered the dangers that came with them, the spoilage, the toxins, and the mistakes that could turn a feast into a tragedy. And we've met spices that once ruled European kitchens but vanished from our plates, only to reappear centuries later in the hands of curious chefs and adventurous cooks. But perhaps the most fascinating lesson is how much of this history still lives with us. If spices once shaped empires, then food today can still shape our world. Culinary trends influence trade, spark cultural exchange, and even alter the way we live together. Just as medieval merchants built fortunes on the flavour of cinnamon and pepper, modern societies are built on the movement of coffee, chocolate, chili, and countless other ingredients across borders. Food connects us not just to each other, but to the long chain of people who have cultivated, preserved, and shared it for generations. So I'll leave you with a question. Which medieval spice would you try first? Would it be the familiar warmth of cinnamon in an unexpected savoury dish, the fiery complexity of long pepper, or the resinous sweetness of mastic? Share your answer in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your curiosity, and maybe even your own experiments with these flavours. Your perspective is what keeps this journey alive, turning history from a story we tell into a conversation we share. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of spices and preservation in the medieval world. Whether you came for the history of the food or simply the curiosity, I hope you leave with new ideas, new flavours to try, and a deeper appreciation for the ingenuity of those who came before us. Until next time, keep your senses open, your table welcoming, and your mind ready to travel across centuries one bite at a time. See you in the next video.